Game of Thrones fans have a rough understanding of the Night King's origins and mission. There's still so much to dig into as to why he did what he did, whether he might rise again, and just how he planned to take over the world beyond Winterfell. The Night King's story begins with the story of Westeros. Before the first men came, the children of the forest lived in harmony with the giants. Though they forged no metal, they developed dragon glass, or as we know it, obsidian, into useful tools and arrowheads, and developed their unique magic. Unfortunately for them, the first men invaded the children's land across a then intact land bridge from Essos. They brought bronze, masses of people, and a thirst for conquest. Though the children's magic was strong enough to shatter the land bridge and separate the two continents, it proved no match for the sheer numbers and sturdy metal weaponry brought by the first men. In a last-ditch attempt to save their way of life, the children drove a dragon glass dagger into a captured first man and used their magic to transform him into an undead being of ice. The Night King, first of his kind, had been born into a world utterly unprepared for his bottomless bloodlust.
It was you. You made the White Walkers.
We were at war.
Though the children and the first men did ultimately end their hostilities, the Night King and his undead disciples, known as White Walkers, had become creatures of entirely alien purpose. Game of Thrones never supplied any specifics as to when the Night King turned his forces against warm-blooded life, nor even how long precisely their icy reign lasted. What is known is that the Night King and his army of undead invaded northern Westeros, and an entire generation suffered and died within the seemingly endless winter they brought. This became known as the Long Night, marked by the failure of crops, massive casualties by the sword, starvation and sickness alike, complete darkness, and the destruction of organized settlements. It was, in the end, the closest the Night King ever came to succeeding in his goal of wiping out all life, and as Bran Stark later pointed out, all memory of life as well. Though the Night King and the White Walkers never advanced beyond Westeros, their terror became legendary. They were ultimately pushed back to the polar wasteland through an enormous conjoined effort of magic, luck, and engineering referred to as the War for the Dawn. Bran the Builder, an ancestor of House Stark, erected a 700-foot-tall barrier known as the Wall through a powerful blend of magic and science so that the blue-eyed menace might never return. Millennia passed, during which the Night King and the Walkers became a long-ago threat, a distant peril, and finally, a story meant to frighten children in the dead of night. Perhaps this was an intentional ploy on the part of the Night King, whose immortality meant he could wait a long time for his opportunity to strike. The long night had given way to the dawn, and the Night King bided his time for 8,000 years. At some point in the decades before the events of Game of Thrones, the Night King demanded a tribute from the wildlings, male infants. As revealed in the Season 4 episode Oathkeeper, they were taken to the lands of Always Winter, laid upon icy altars, and turned into White Walkers by the Night King himself. The process is apparently simple, yet notably enigmatic. It's a different process than we see when the Night King raises corpses as whites, but we never learn how often it was done, if every walker had the power to do this, nor how many human infants were turned over the course of the 8,000-year retreat. Like so many things about the Night King and his subjects, this horrifying element would remain a mystery. Once he had gathered whatever number of corpses and infant sacrifices that he thought would be enough to conquer Westeros, the Night King sent out his forces to harass, murder, and generally terrorize the wildlings. One especially horrible manifestation of this campaign makes up the first scene of the show's very first episode. Recall the Night's Watch deserter beheaded by Ned Stark, the artfully arranged circle of corpse parts, and the dark shadow that would be all the audience saw of the Walkers until the Season 2 finale. Westeros remained largely ignorant of the threat, but some were not so lucky. The Walkers were making a statement, and the Night King showed no interest in pulling back as the rumors grew. In fact, it's likely that he was very purposefully looking to sow that sort of fear. As the wildlings grew more terrified, the Night's Watch grew divided as to how to deal with them. Dissent festered, culminating in Jon Snow's murder and the mutiny against Lord Commander Mormont. The humans had been turned against themselves, and all the Night King had to do was be there to turn the corpses into his army. Years passed over the course of the first 5 seasons of Game of Thrones while the Night King gathered his strength. The Night's Watch came to understand the White Walkers as a clear and present danger, finally realizing that they were up against thousands of corpses raised to fight against the living. It all came to a head in Season 5's Hardhome. Hardhome was the closest thing the wildlings ever had to a city. It's where Jon Snow, Tormund Giantsbane, and a handful of Night's Watchmen and like-minded wildlings traveled to urge its denizens to join them in the fight against the Walkers. But their best-laid plans went belly up when the Walkers attacked just as the wildling boats set to sail to the Wall were beginning to fill. An avalanche of whites overran the crude settlement, slaying thousands in a savage surge of brutality. In the midst of the slaughter, Jon Snow discovered Valyrian steel's resiliency against Walker ice magic, and immediately after, its ability to shatter the beings themselves. Those fighting on the side of the living might have learned something crucial about Valyrian steel, but it came at a terrible cost. While Jon Snow and the Night's Watch were battling the Walkers with sword and shield, Bran Stark was on a crusade of his own, learning to harness his psychic powers. Emboldened, he entered a vision, only to be spotted by the Night King, who was able to grab Bran's arm across miles of distance and brand it with his mark.
But he can't get in.
He can now.
Despite Hodor's tragic sacrifice and the children's magic, the Walkers were not stopped. Though the three-eyed raven was able to pass on his powers to Bran, he still fell to the Night King's spear, along with many of what might have been the only children of the forest left. In stripping Bran of his most important allies, protectors, and teachers, he managed to further that goal considerably. As the Night King neared the Wall, Jon Snow proposed something drastic, gathering a party of warriors to capture a white that would prove the truth of the threat to Queen Cersei and her skeptical court. Though the grizzled band was, in fact, able to present the Queen with a real-deal blue-eyed corpse, it came at tremendous cost. The Walkers and their army killed much of the group, including Viserion, one of Daenerys Targaryen's trio of dragons. The fact that Cersei didn't join forces with Daenerys and Jon in the war against the Walkers is cruel enough, but even worse, the Night King was able to raise Viserion as an undead dragon, complete with the ability to breathe massively destructive blue fire. Jon Snow might have accomplished what he set out to do in the most literal sense, but on a much more important scale, this was yet another victory for the Night King. The army of death had only grown in its size and sinister capabilities.
The Night King is coming.
The dead are already here.
It wasn't long before the Night King decided to put his brand new steed to the test. Leading untold thousands of resurrected corpses, a host of mounted White Walkers, and a fearsome number of undead beasts, the Night King descended upon the castle of Eastwatch by the Sea with frozen fury. One fiery assault from Viserion was all it took to pierce the wall. Thousands of tons of enchanted ice, rock, and masonry fell beneath the eerie blue flame, leaving a clear road through to Westeros. It was this shocking image that closed out the 7th season finale of Game of Thrones, the last best defense of the living, torn asunder at last. The wall, which had stood for 8,000 years, had fallen before the Night King and his seemingly unstoppable army. All he had left to do was massacre his prey, starting with Winterfell and all the living souls who dwelt within. The Night King advanced upon the north quickly. His first stop was the last Hearth, the home of House Umber. Though battered by the war and tasked with maintaining a remote position between the unknown wastes and the comforts of Winterfell, Umber was a proud house with a long and glorious history. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Bastards, the house was headed by Lord Ned Umber, a 10-year-old looking to regain the honor lost when his family backed the Boltons.
Will you stand beside me, Ned and Alice, now and always?
Unfortunately, the Night King made that always quite a bit shorter than it should have been. The last Hearth was the Walkers' first stop on the way to Winterfell, and after slaughtering Ned Umber and his household, they left a grim warning behind in the form of their characteristic spiral of body parts. Though Ned was prevented from causing more carnage as a white courtesy of a flaming sword, killing Umber stands as one of the saddest crimes the Night King perpetrated. With the wall breached, the armies massed, a dragon risen from the grave, and the living forces of Westeros getting their hands on every ounce of dragon glass that they could. There was no time for preparation. Instead, it was war. the Night King descended upon Winterfell like a tempest, swallowing the fires of Dothraki warriors, trenches of flame, and valiant charges alike within his icy darkness. Beyond the mayhem and death that he brought with him, the Night King had a mission: to find Bran Stark, the new three-eyed raven, and kill him. Bran knew this and allowed himself to be used as bait. The stakes were high. Theon Greyjoy died in his efforts to protect Bran. The dead in the crypts and on the battlefields of Winterfell were raised by the Night King's powers, and Jon Snow resorted to facing Viserion with nothing but a sword. Then out of nowhere came Arya Stark, honed into one of the finest warriors alive. With one swift stab, the Night King was slain, along with all the creatures he'd created. The army of the dead was gone. An eternity of winter had been avoided, and the White Walkers, with the death of their leader and progenitor, instantly became extinct. Thus ended the war audiences had been teased with for years. With Arya's devastatingly precise stab, she vanquished the White Walkers completely. The Night King's reign of terror lives on, however, in the hearts of Game of Thrones' principal characters. Jon Snow, free at last to live beyond titles and great houses, cannot ever rid himself of the evil he stared down, and returns to the Night's Watch. Bran, elevated to king, is also tasked with remembering what brought the Walkers about in the first place. Arya, off on adventures beyond the borders of Westeros, will doubtlessly be followed everywhere she goes by the fact of her great world-saving deed. These and many other characters now live in a Westeros that's as much defined by the Night King's absence as it was by his presence. The Night King might be dead, but his memory will linger on for years to come, if only as a terrifying fairy tale. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite shows are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.